The essence of Module 3 is to help you and prepare you to write a good policy analysis paper. The policy paper is going to count for a large portion of your grade, and so taking it seriously and getting off on a good start is really good. You should continue to refer back to Module 3 during the course of the semester, because as you learn more, it'll be important to continue to put it and file it into the parts of the paper that you're going to be writing. On some level, all papers that you ever write for a course are really essay exams on the material in the course. So such that you're able to bring ideas from lectures, from readings, from text, and from videos that you're watching into your final paper, the more impressive that will be. You'll both be showing off what you've learned and creating a better paper, at least in the view of the instructor who assigned those readings to begin with. So I'm going to go over with you here several ideas that I have on how to write a good policy paper. I would also pay particular attention to each of the PDFs that I've created with respect to the policy paper. They will give you some insight into what I'm learning, or what I'm saying you should learn rather, and also maybe be some guidance on how to do well in the course. So why is it even worthwhile to learn how to write a good policy paper? Uh, Quite apart from saying, how do I write a paper that's going to impress Carl Snook? What I'm really saying is, why would you ever write a policy paper of any kind for any course, or even in real life? A good policy analysis paper will answer all of the important questions presented by the assignment. And as you go into your career, you'll say, well, what is my assignment? Well, my assignment is going to be to answer the questions and concerns of the person that I'm going to be working for at some point, or the political body that I'm trying to influence. So you want to present decision makers with all the information necessary to arrive at a sound conclusion. We're utilizing a type of methodology, so you'll be able to claim some expertise in applying a certain framework for solving policy problems that will help governmental institutions as they make their decisions. And so it's important to be able to write in a structure that the organizations are used to seeing, that they'll understand, and so that you'll be able to influence them better. In the same way that if you were going to France, I might suggest you should pick up a few words of French to make sure that you can communicate. This is a structure for writing papers that will help you communicate with political decision makers. And so, what does that entail? Well, certainly you're going to want to define the goals and evaluate the alternatives in a way that these decision makers are going to understand, appreciate, and see a linkage between what they want and what you want as well. Now here's an important slide that you should look to bookmark so that you can refer back to it later. This spells out what I see as a typical structure for a paper, and as much as this, it is something that will give you a framework to work on as you're going through and you're building your own policy paper. Now the Bardock book is going to present its eightfold plan, and I want you to read that, and I want you to pay particular attention to it, and I want you to see where there's synergies between Bardock's approach and the structure that's placed here. And obviously, either the Bardock book or this structure that I'm showing here would be acceptable as ways to approach your paper. But I think that it's very important that as you're formulating your paper, now maybe you don't want to say Roman numeral 1 problem, right? You might want to give the problem a name. But we are going to have a course that is problem oriented. We are going to solve problems. Now you might be the type of person who someday is working for a business or for an advocacy group that has a particular alternative that it's trying to sell to different policy decision makers. Particularly, let's say one day you're working for a software company that has a statistical package that can be used by business or industry. And so the problem that one particular business might be having, and then some government agency might be having, might not be the same, but your alternative might work to solve either of their problems. Now, that's not the approach that we're taking in this course. In this course, we are looking and we're seeing the problem through the perspective of policy decision makers, and then we're going to select alternatives best designed to solve that problem. This makes us a little bit more of a consumer of policy than as a producer of alternatives. But that's the structure we're looking toward. So your first step is going to be define the policy problem. Next, you're going to establish goals or criteria for any selected alternative. What is fixed? You have to decide both on a broad level what a policy system that no longer suffers from that problem would look like, or at least one where the policy problem has been ameliorated, is not as severe as it once was. And then you're going to say, well, what are some concrete milestones that we might be able to look to say, hey, we've actually solved this. And then when you are judging alternatives, you're going to be able to say, well, how do these mile markers and the goals of the alternative match each other? Next, you're going to select an alternative, and you might have several alternatives. I would hope that you'd have at least 2 alternatives. 3 is better. 2 alternatives would be the status quo versus, well, what if we come up with my new policy alternative? But a third good alternative would be a competing plan for solving a problem. So if you were to only present the difference between, well, here's the status quo and here is my plan for, arresting all lawyers. Well, it might be that arresting all lawyers is better than the status quo, but I would assure you that there's probably an alternative that would be less severe and would solve whatever problem that was. Fourth, you're going to plan for implementing a policy. You're going to say, well, how would it work if we actually did something? If we actually carried it out, how would it be implemented? And then we might come up with a plan for evaluating the policy. Now, that might not be the paper in and of itself, but that's the fundamental steps that we're going to take, right? As we become more adept at writing in our careers, what we aren't going to do is we aren't going to write a paper and find the information as we're going along. Really, a policy analysis paper or a policy proposal is a report of an analysis that's already been done. So really, the process, I guess, can start anywhere. But ultimately, this plan needs to be carried out. This research needs to be carried out even before the paper can be written. And then writing the paper often becomes a process of filling in the gaps, as we'll see here coming. So what do we mean by defining the problem? We should define the nature of the problem. Who does it harm? Who are the other stakeholders? In fact, it might not be a problem to every person who is interested in the policy. I would imagine that having really low wage workers is less of a problem to the person paying the wage than it is to the workers themselves. However, you wouldn't say that the owner of a coal mine wasn't a stakeholder in your regulation of coal mines. You should try to avoid confusing the symptoms and the causes. So we're really interested, as much as anything, in finding the causes of problems, because the solutions will tend to be things that deal with the causes rather than just deal with the symptoms. Though you might need to address both. So what caused the problem? How important is the problem? Ultimately, if you have a problem that nobody cares about, then is it really a problem? Now, I would assert that on some level, if you show that it's a problem at all, if we're talking about leaf removal in public parks in Atlanta, Georgia, that becomes a problem if you don't remove the leaves. You know, somebody is tasked with doing that. Find us an inexpensive, effective way to do it, and I think that most people would be in favor of it. So you don't have to show that the earth will end if your problem isn't solved, but you should show that there's an inconvenience or a problem of some sort that needs to be addressed. And we should consider whether there should be a focus on speed, efficiency, equity, etc. in solving the problem. Is this something that can be put on the back burner if, say, there was a global pandemic? Or is it something that should be addressed anyway? So in defining or establishing goals and criteria, we should say, well, you know, what is our desired end state? What does the world look like when this problem doesn't exist anymore? Or do we recognize this problem will be with us always and that we just need to help people to deal with it across time? You know, if you look at something like plastics, right? If you say, well, our goal is to eliminate plastics, well, that creates a problem. But it might be that your goal is to minimize the negative effects of plastics. Or it might be that you say, we're not going to be able to minimize the negative effects. We're just going to learn how to deal with those negative effects. Whatever you decide, you need to spell out what your desired end state is. And how will you know? How will you know if an alternative is working? What are the rules for that? I said in the previous slide, what are the milestones on your path to solving the problem? How do you judge the policy alternatives? Who will be making the decision? And then finally, what are those the goals of that decision maker? It might be altogether possible that as you try to be a policy analyst, that you're not always going to be working for people who have the same exact goals that you do, or that you might be working for people who have the same goals as you do, but you're trying to develop policies to advocate to people who have slightly different goals. You know, if Brian Kemp is the decision maker, it's altogether possible that if you are working for the Sierra Club, you aren't going to be dealing with a governor who has exactly your goals, but you might be able to find places where your goals and his goals interact in such a way. Often that's in politics and his desire to be reelected, but sometimes he will share with you policy goals that you can hope will influence him to adopt some or all of your proposal. So when you're selecting a policy, one of the things that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to say, well, what are my alternatives? What are all the things that we might be able to do? What alternatives meet these criteria we've already set? And we should consider trade-offs. There's always going to be trade-offs. If we have the perfect policy, it's still probably going to affect it in some way people who aren't going to feel as great a benefit from it as others. If we have a policy where we're raising taxes in order to solve your problem, well, the people who are paying the taxes might have to decide that they're willing to give up this little bit of money in order to achieve this goal. It might be that the trade-off, that the cost is very high as compared to the benefit. But that's a determination that you're going to need to make. Now, cost versus benefit is the typical methodology, but there's other approaches that we can look at in terms of trade-offs. And what are the political, organizational, financial, and technological limitations? Certainly, when we talk about some of the things that have been looked at to address the coronavirus pandemic or global warming or poverty, sometimes the problems that we see, it's not so much that we don't solve them because people don't want them to be solved. There's definitely policy problems that aren't solved because people don't want them to be solved. But there's others that everybody wants there to be a solution, but it's just not possible. You can't have there be a vaccine because you wish there was a vaccine. You can't have there be a technology that eliminates the need for, say, fossil fuels in the next 10 years just because you want there to be. You might come up with a technological innovation that's going to help, but it won't happen just because you've desired that it will. There's political limitations. Sometimes you really want something. Sometimes it is technologically feasible, but people won't accept it politically. It might be that you just can't get it done with the human resources or the institutional arrangements that you currently have, and you might just not be able to afford it. So there are limitations that you need to take into account, and the policy you choose has to actually be something that is possible. Entire courses are taught on policy implementation. Even if there is an agreement to enact a policy, even if there's a desire to enact a policy, sometimes implementation changes the policy dramatically. We ask questions like who is responsible for implementing a policy. Sometimes the group that is closest to a policy has the greatest technical expertise are not the groups of people who are the most likely to wish to implement the policy as you desire it to be. Who will be impacted by the policy change and what will their reaction be? You're asking them to pay a large conformity cost if it's not the policy that they desire. On the other hand, maybe the people who benefit the most from your policy also might not be the most politically powerful people. Sometimes you implement a policy change designed to benefit a group of people, And then that group of people might not exactly desire that this change occurs. Imagine a policy designed to help heroin addicts. It's quite possible that the heroin addict himself might not choose that policy that you've just implemented. Mandatory drug treatment, for instance. Well, what would be the effect of having the impact be on somebody who wishes not to be impacted, even though your desire to help is what's causing you to implement the policy? Who will be resistant or supportive? Who are your friends and enemies, right? What is the overall expectation for resistance? Could another institution do a better job of implementing the policy? When you consider, for instance, certain, I watched a program about the siege at Waco, where a bunch of members of a minority religious group were killed or killed themselves. I guess that's still debate all these years later, by an FBI raid. Well, it began with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms botching an attempt to arrest the leader of this group. And then the FBI had a standoff that lasted a long period of time, and then ended up in a fire that resulted in the deaths of men, women, and children in the compound. And the debate over who started the fire, the debate over whether the members had already committed suicide when the fire began, things such as this are very much still in the air all these years later. But the question is, well, what would have happened if the sheriff had just arrested David Koresh one day when he was out walking? He went out walking. What if he was just arrested then? What if the ATF had done it then? What if some other procedure had been instituted and a different institution had tried to implement the policy? I'm not saying not to arrest him. I'm just saying, what if someone else had? So policy implementation is a critical aspect. And so you should have some plan for implementing the policy along with your proposal. Policy making doesn't always end. In fact, sometimes it continues forever on an iterative basis. We're going to learn about how most policy change in the United States occurs in form of incremental changes, tiny improvements that are found over time. And a lot of this is because of the evaluation of a policy. Sometimes a policy evaluation leads to the recognition that a problem exists and that it's not being solved by current policy. And sometimes policy evaluation says we can just tinker here or there and make things better. So part of any policy analysis is policy evaluation on an ongoing basis. And so you'll want to set up rules and plans for evaluating the policy going forward. Does or did the policy meet its goals? Did the policy solve the problem as you was expected? Did the benefits justify the cost? And was the policy a success? Unless you come up with a plan for how you will judge this, maybe you'll never really know whether your policy worked. So how is this going to work in practice? How is this going to work this semester? Well, if you suggest a new policy, you will not be discussing the evaluation, right? It won't even be implemented this semester. It won't be implemented until you get out into the world and have the opportunity to work for somebody who's going to help you improve your proposal, and then maybe someday you'll actually be talking to a political leader. In fact, it should be an element of your problem definition that you consider which policy or policies have been attempted already. So in a way, policy evaluation comes first, not last, in this process in practice. So as you're writing your paper, you might say, well, this is the structure that I'm going to try for this semester. You're going to want to define the problem. You're going to want to discuss what's been tried in the past. This could be a historical look at the problem. You could select goals and criteria. You could select politically, technologically, organizationally, and financially feasible alternatives. And then you could conduct a cost-benefit analysis, or at least a comparison of the alternatives and what you expect will happen. You can select the best policy and justify it according to whether it meets the needs and goals set. And that might be all that you're able to actually do this summer. Or I should say this semester, right? So that I can use this again in the future. But in any case, I think that what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to have a structure to your paper that is going to match both the template that we set out in the beginning and this in-practice approach that I've suggested here. And finally, you know, you are writing a paper, right? And you have some goals that are similar to any paper you ever write, whether you're writing a novel about space aliens coming to Earth trying to teach us better farming techniques, or whether you're writing a paper for, you know, to prove a mathematical theorem. You're going to want to be interesting. You're going to want to show how the policy is important, but also make it easy to understand and read. Remember, the people that you write for when you are a policy analyst will be people who are primarily decision makers because they know how to impress the right people. Be accurate. You know, ideally, the difference between a good paper and a bad paper is often whether it is vague or whether it is specific. We're going to learn from Stone that ambiguity is useful, but note that she has an entire section on numbers. She has an entire section on symbols. She's aware that people look and they see numbers and as important elements of arguments. So if you're able to give me numbers, if you're able to give me detail, it's going to show a level of research that should be very useful to you. You should just support all of your assertions with sources and data. I say avoid wordiness. Maybe this is one of my biggest challenges, right? But you only have 10 to 12 pages. So the more concise you are, the more knowledge you can fit into the space provided. You need to balance what can safely be left out with what is necessary to put in. No one's going to know, you know, if you write a 15-page paper for an assignment that says 12 pages, I'm not going to be impressed, right? I know you could write a 40-page paper or a 100-page paper, or given time, you could write a 1,000-page paper on any one of these subjects. 10 to 12 is a limitation both in how long it needs to be, but also in how short it needs to be. Make sure that you read all of the other supporting materials in this module. I really think that you should look at the note on source quality, the checklist, the rubric, the directions. If you are very familiar with what's required in Chapter 3, it's going to really benefit you this semester with writing your paper.